I came to a point in my mind that I knew it was all dead. And it's just a matter of time. And it didn't even matter. Except that I was hoping that if they killed any of us, they was going to kill us all and do it quick, because I didn't want to see
parts of the building have collapsed.
Everyone here in Naples agrees that Weaver is a white supremacist who just wants to be left alone.
We had been in
For
contact
police,
with the FBI and ITF, and they were to follow normal
Baby killer!
This case takes place in the United States of America in Oklahoma. On the 19th of April 1995, the worst domestic-born terror attack on US soil claimed the lives of 168 people and injured almost 1,000 more. Amongst the dead were 19 children. The man responsible, Timothy McVeigh, had constructed a truck bomb with his co-conspirator Terry Nichols before leaving it outside the Alfred P Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Both Nichols, and in particular McVeigh, were deathly fearful of federal interference with gun rights, and this soon developed into paranoia. Following the disastrous handling of the Ruby Ridge and Waco standoffs, McVeigh was radicalized and committed a horrendous act of terror. Timothy McVeigh was born in April of 1968 as the middle child of a blue-collar family in Pendleton, New York. At age 10, his parents divorced, with Timothy remaining with his father whilst his mother took custody of his two sisters. As a teenager, Timothy claimed he was bullied. He would find solace when he would go shooting with his grandfather, a hobby that Timothy would carry with him for the rest of his life. Despite a promising talent for computer programming, Timothy dropped out of a college course on the matter and opted to join the United States military instead. It was as a recruit that Timothy became exposed to a book called The Turner Diaries, which was written by a neo-Nazi named William Luther Pierce. The book is a hate-filled screed about a white supremacist and neo-Nazi terror attacks. The book contains graphic descriptions of violence carried out against Jews, black people, and government officials. Not merely a novel, the book sought to encourage white supremacist militias to rise up against the oppressive government. In a grim precursor or blueprint to the Oklahoma City bombing, one of the attacks in the novel was a truck bombing of a federal building. Timothy would read this book and encourage as many as he could to read it too. He would do all of this whilst training as a soldier. In 1991, Timothy was part of Operation Storm and the liberation of Kuwait from Iraq forces, but that very same year he would leave the army honorably discharged. He sold military supplies, survivalist materials, and copies of the Turner Diaries. He did these things with a former army friend, Terry Nichols. Anti-government sentiments only grew, especially following two events that to Timothy confirmed that the government not only wanted to confiscate guns, but also would be prepared to kill anyone and their families who opposed them. I am of course talking about the standoff at Ruby Ridge and the Waco siege. I do have videos on both topics and the links will be in the description. But in short, both of these cases were poorly handled, resulting in the deaths of many people, including children. Federal agencies were widely criticized for their poor handling of the situation and for escalating the violence. Timothy had even attended protests at the Waco siege. Shortly after seeing the final storming and destruction of the Waco compound, Timothy and Terry began to plot their revenge on the federal government. Timothy had initially planned to assassinate Janet Reno, though soon realized the impracticability and low chance of success. Terry would soon begin to teach Timothy how to construct homemade bombs, having been convinced to act by Timothy and having seen the use of tear gas on the Branch Davidians at Waco. The pair set about gathering explosive materials, purchasing dozens of bags of ammonium nitrate, plenty of explosive Tovex, and gallons of nitromethane. On the 14th of April, preparations were made for the attack. Timothy set up his getaway car and booked a stay in a motel under a false name. Between the 17th and 18th of April, the bombs were prepared and the materials were mixed in large metal drums. These drums were loaded into the back of a rental truck and arranged in a way to cause maximum damage. The truck was also set up in a way so if the primary fuse failed, Timothy would be able to detonate the bomb from the driver's car, but this also meant blowing himself up in the process. On the morning of the 19th of April, Timothy drove the rental truck and parked outside the Alfred P Murrah Federal Building on the north side. En route, he had already lit the fuses. By 9:02 AM, the truck bomb exploded. The explosion was equivalent to 5,000 tons of TNT. It completely tore through the north side of the federal building, resulting in a total collapse of the side in a matter of seconds. Floors collapsed onto one another as shards of glass tore through the building. Of the 168 people who died as a result of the blast, the vast majority were in the federal building. Many of those who died were crushed under the fallen debris as opposed to the initial blast. 19 children were tragically killed, many of whom were in the building's daycare center. The youngest to die was 3-month-old Gabriel Bruce, who was there with his family to obtain a social security card. Timothy would later claim he had not realized that there was a daycare center in the building, whilst Terry claimed they were both aware but continued anyway. Regardless, Timothy is quoted as justifying the deaths of the children as little more than collateral damage. Soon enough, massive rescue and relief operations were underway. Thousands of civilians and government workers rushed to the site and tried to rescue all they could. In their efforts, they were able to pull around 50 people from the rubble, the last being a teenage girl in the evening of the 19th. All but 3 of the bodies were recovered. Meanwhile, Timothy attempted his escape in his getaway car, though was soon pulled over as the license plate had been removed. Once pulled over, State Trooper Charlie Hanger realized Timothy had an illegal concealed firearm. He was totally unaware that he had just arrested the bomber responsible for the reports coming through his radio. Initial suspicion for the bomb was placed on Middle Eastern terrorists or Saddam Hussein. The use of truck bombs had an echo of the World Trade Center, whilst the size of the explosion pointed to a foreign government, but clues were strewn amongst the carnage. The axle of the rental truck had been blown a couple of blocks away. It was located and its serial number cross-checked. The rental agency owner was able to provide a description of Timothy, who was soon traced to his motel. Federal agents soon realized that Timothy was already in custody, having faced the courts on the 21st of April for his gun possession charge. Terry turned himself in on the same day. Timothy was found guilty of 11 counts of murder and conspiracy, and as a result, was sentenced to death. Such was the demand to view the execution, a lottery system had been set up to select those who could watch in person, and Timothy's death was transmitted via closed-circuit television to those who could not be there in person. Timothy was executed on the 11th of June 2001, the first federal execution in 38 years. Terry was initially tried and found guilty of conspiracy to build a bomb and involuntary manslaughter, and was sentenced to life without parole. But in 2004, Terry was found guilty of a further 161 counts of murder, and sentenced to 161 consecutive life sentences. As is often the case with such huge events, a number of theories have developed. A severed leg was found in the rubble that did not belong to any of the victims, some believing it belonged to a second bomber. Timothy was sighted with an unknown man dubbed John Doe 2, notably when Timothy rented the truck used in the bombing. Whilst Timothy and Terry were the 2 found guilty for the bombing, questions still exist as to whether others were involved. Timothy is reported to have ties with a number of white supremacist organizations and individuals. During the trial, little emphasis was placed on the anti-government sentiment, and that the events of Ruby Ridge and Waco were key factors for their radicalization. In fact, the 19th of April 1995 was the 2-year anniversary of the final day of the siege, the calamitous day where dozens died. and that they had chosen the Alfred P Murrah building as the ATF had offices there. The ATF was the federal agency responsible for the failed raid that started the sieges in the first place. Although Terry and Timothy were portrayed as the key actors in the bombing, there were a number of others who played a part. James Nichols, brother to Terry, was arrested and questioned, though little evidence was found for involvement. A married couple named Michael and Laurie Fortier were detained for their knowledge of the plot. Michael testified as a star witness in exchange for a reduced sentence for him and immunity for his wife. Michael was sentenced to 12 years in jail. Timothy compared his attack to the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, claiming that it was necessary to prevent more lives from being lost at the hands of the government. Timothy never expressed any remorse for his actions, even attempting to raise the defense of necessity at his trial. Timothy believed that his act would inspire others to rise up, just like in his beloved Turner Diaries novel. He had extracts and copies of the book on his person, and hoped he would inspire others to fight against what he saw as government tyranny. The Oklahoma bombing is the culmination of the previous videos covering Ruby Ridge and the Waco siege. These events were the proof Timothy needed that the government was a tyrannical force that would stop at nothing to strip people of their Second Amendment rights. He saw the deaths of children as abhorrent examples of the cruelty that the government would inflict, despite doing the very same thing himself. There is no doubt that Ruby Ridge and Waco could have been handled better, which was more likely due to fatal incompetence rather than tyranny, though Timothy was primed by the hateful writings of the Turner Diaries. In the end, Timothy was capable of placing a truck bomb in the path of not only a federal building, but the daycare center within it. The Oklahoma bombing highlighted that seemingly anyone from anywhere has the potential to commit acts of terror. Whilst Timothy was anti-government to the extreme, his targets were innocents who held federal government jobs. His goal to unite Americans against the federal state failed. A link in the description will be available for the victims of the bombing, and I would invite you all to take the time to read about them.